The diner was packed that Tuesday morning, the way it always is when the weather turns cold in Nashville and people stop wanting to eat at home. I was sitting at my usual table near the window, the one with the cracked vinyl seat I'd been meaning to complain about for 3 years, and I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the room started to tilt. Not spin. Exactly. Tilt. Like someone had placed a hand beneath the city and lifted one edge of it just slightly. I set the mug down. My chest felt strange. Tight in a way that wasn't pain but wasn't right either. I pressed 2 fingers to my wrist automatically, an old habit from decades of working under pressure, feeling for my pulse. Rapid, unsteady. I told myself it was the caffeine. Then the man across the booth from me said something I couldn't quite hear because the ringing in my ears had started. I gripped the edge of the table. My vision narrowed at the edges like someone slowly closing a curtain. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own wrist and the black smartwatch clasped around it, its screen glowing a steady, patient green. Before I tell you the rest, let me ask you something. Where are you right now as you listen to this? What city? What state? What corner of this country? Drop a comment below and let me know. I want to know you're out there. This story, more than most I've shared, is one I need someone to hear. And one more thing before we begin. Some details of this account have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The core of what happened, every critical truth is real. My name is Daniel Harmon. I spent 31 years on the federal bench in Nashville, Tennessee. I retired at 62 at the top of my career. Still sharp, still capable, still running 3 miles every morning along the Cumberland River before the sun came up all the way. I am not, as my son once tried to suggest in front of a room full of people, a man who needs to be watched over. I want you to understand that before anything else. I want you to hold on to it. My wife Ruth died 19 months before any of this happened. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors called swift and merciful, and which I called the worst 4 months of my life without qualification. We had been married 38 years. She used to leave notes in my briefcase on days I had difficult cases, just small things, sometimes only a few words, sometimes a joke so bad it made me laugh in spite of myself. After she was gone, I kept opening that briefcase every morning for 6 weeks before I remembered there would be nothing inside it. I am telling you this so you understand what my son Marcus walked back into when he showed up at my front door on a Saturday in February with a duffel bag over his shoulder and that careful, calibrated expression on his face that I should have recognized for what it was. Marcus is 40. He works in financial consulting in Atlanta, a career I never fully understood despite him explaining it to me multiple times, and which involved enough travel that our phone calls were sporadic at best. We had always been close in the way that fathers and sons who respect each other but don't entirely understand each other are close with affection, with some distance, with things left unspoken on both sides. He had called me 3 days before showing up. "Dad, I've been thinking," he said. His voice had that measured quality. The one Ruth always said reminded her of a man reading from a script he'd memorized. "About everything. About how you're doing out there alone. I want to take some time. Come back to Nashville for a while. Be around." I told him I was doing fine. I told him I appreciated it. He came anyway. The first few days felt good. He cooked. He sat with me in the evenings the way Ruth used to sit with me, both of us reading in the same room, the quiet, comfortable, rather than empty. He asked about my old cases, my golf game, the friends I still met for breakfast on Wednesdays. He seemed genuinely interested, or at least he seemed like a man working very hard to seem genuinely interested, which is a distinction I was not yet making at the time. On his 4th day back, he placed a box on the kitchen table in front of me. It was matte black, sleek, the kind of packaging that signals something expensive before you've even opened it. "It's a LifeSync Pro," he said, opening the box himself, lifting out a smartwatch with the careful reverence of a man presenting something precious. Medical grade. It tracks heart rhythm, blood oxygen, stress indicators, all of it. Sends real-time data directly to my phone. He looked at me the way doctors look at patients when they're about to deliver a number that matters. "You've been alone out here, Dad. If something happened and you couldn't call for help, I'd have no way of knowing. This way I know. Every minute. Every day. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, denser than any consumer device I'd handled. The face was clean. The display minimal. It looked legitimate. It looked like the kind of thing you'd see advertised in a medical journal. This must have cost a fortune, I said. It doesn't matter what it cost. He sat down across from me. You matter. Ruth would have wanted someone looking after you. I put it on. I want you to notice something about that moment. I am a man who spent 3 decades evaluating evidence, scrutinizing arguments, weighing credibility. I presided over 340 federal cases. I was not naive. I was not impaired. I was not diminished by age or grief into someone who could no longer think clearly. I put it on because he was my son, and he had come home, and it had been 19 months since Ruth died, and the house had been so quiet. The first symptom appeared 5 days later. I was on my morning run along the river, the route I'd been running for 4 years without issue, when I felt the breathlessness. Not exertion, breathlessness, different, heavier. I slowed to a walk, and the tightness in my chest took nearly 10 minutes to release. I told myself it was the cold air. I told myself I'd pushed too hard. By the second week, the tightness was arriving without exertion. I'd be sitting in my study reading, and suddenly my heart would stammer, miss a beat, catch, stammer again. Dizziness came next. Once in the grocery store, once in the middle of a phone call with my old clerk, a woman named Patricia, who'd worked with me for 15 years, and who I could tell was alarmed by the way my voice dropped mid-sentence. I called Marcus each time. His responses were consistent. Calm. Clinical. Dad, that's exactly what the watch is for. It's detecting the irregularities and logging them. Your heart rhythm has always had a slight variability. Remember? The cardiologist mentioned it 2 years ago. This device is just making you more aware of something that was already there. Don't read too much into it. I did not ask how he had access to my cardiology records. I should have. I didn't. The watch, he reminded me each time, needed to stay on. Constant skin contact was essential for accurate monitoring. Taking it off, even briefly, could create gaps in the data. And gaps in the data meant he couldn't protect me. Let me stop here and ask you something directly. If your child gave you a device and told you it was the only thing keeping you safe, if the alternative they offered was something happening to you and no one knowing, would you question it? Or would you wear it? Be honest with yourself, because I know my answer. And it wasn't the right one. The calls began arriving every morning between 7 and 7:30. He always opened the same way. How are you feeling? Sleeping okay? Any episodes last night? At first I appreciated them. By the 3rd week they felt like check-ins. By the 4th week they felt like something else. Something I didn't have a word for yet. It was my friend Gerald who first said it out loud. Gerald Beaumont, 66 years old, retired surgeon, a man I've known for 23 years and who golfs badly and laughs loudly and has never once in his life softened a difficult truth for the sake of someone's comfort. We were at the Wednesday breakfast. The 4 of us, Gerald, myself, Ray, and Clifford and I mentioned that I'd declined a fishing trip to Norris Lake because Marcus had suggested the exertion might not be advisable given my recent episodes. Gerald set down his fork. Danny, he said, using the name only people who've known me longer than my career use. When did Marcus become your doctor? He's concerned, I said. I'm concerned too. Gerald looked at me steadily. But I'm a surgeon and I'm sitting right here and I'm telling you that what you're describing, the breathlessness, the cardiac irregularities, appearing out of nowhere and then fading, that pattern doesn't match a pre-existing arrhythmia becoming worse. That's not what that looks like. I told him I appreciated his concern. I changed the subject, but his words found somewhere in me they didn't leave. It was 2 days after the breakfast that I noticed the small things I'd been not noticing for weeks. Marcus had mentioned, during one of our evening conversations, that he'd bumped into Gerald at the grocery store. Gerald doesn't shop in my neighborhood. I hadn't told Marcus which grocery store Gerald uses. He'd referenced a conversation I'd had with Patricia, specific phrases, specific context from a call I had made from my study while Marcus was supposedly out. He'd known, one Tuesday afternoon, that I had taken a different route for my walk, a route I hadn't told anyone about, and he'd mentioned it in the middle of a sentence, about something else entirely, casually, the way people let things slip when they forget they're not supposed to know. That night, after Marcus went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table alone, and I looked at the watch on my wrist. I thought about my years on the bench, about evidence, about the difference between coincidence and pattern, about the way a case begins to resolve not at the verdict but at the moment you stop telling yourself there's another explanation. I took the watch off. I expected nothing. I expected my heart to continue its irregular behavior, to feel the same tightness, to confirm that the watch was indeed only monitoring and not causing. Within 40 minutes, the tightness was gone. Within 2 hours, I felt more like myself than I had in a month. I sat there for a long time, the watch on the table in front of me, thinking. Then I turned it over in my hands and looked at the back of it. Really looked. And there in the space between the sensors and the casing, barely visible unless you were tilting it under direct light, were ports that didn't belong on any smartwatch I had ever seen. Smaller than a pinhole. Multiple. I didn't put it back on. My phone rang at 6:47 the next morning. Before I even said hello, Marcus's voice came through, clipped and stripped of its usual warmth. "Dad." The watch stopped transmitting. "I know," I said. I took it off. The pause that followed lasted long enough that I counted the seconds. 4 of them. "Why would you do that?" Not a question. A statement delivered in a register I had never heard from my son before. Flat. Empty of the careful concern he usually packaged everything in. "Because something is wrong," I said. "Marcus, the symptoms stop when it's off. That's not possible." His voice had found its footing again, pivoting back to clinical. "You're experiencing a psychological response. Anxiety about your health is manifesting as physical symptoms. The watch is the only accurate record of your cardiac activity. Without it, if something happens, something is happening," I said. "And I think it's the watch. Put it back on, Dad." "No, I need you to listen to me very carefully." His tone changed again, hardening at the edges. "You are 63 years old. You live alone. You have a documented cardiac irregularity. If you refuse to wear a medical monitoring device, I am going to have to contact your physician and discuss whether you are capable of making sound decisions about your own care." That was the moment. Not the breathlessness. Not the dizzy spells. Not even the evidence of surveillance I hadn't yet confirmed but already understood. That sentence was the moment, because I had presided over enough cases to know exactly what it meant. He was not threatening to help me. He was threatening to use the medical establishment as a lever to take away my autonomy, my judgment, my freedom. I put the watch back on. I told him I would. I kept my voice even, because 31 years on the federal bench teaches you to keep your voice even when everything inside you is not. After we hung up, I sat very still and thought about strategy. That same morning, I drove across town to see a woman named Beverly Okafor. Beverly is 68 years old, a retired federal investigator, 12 years with the FBI's cyber division before she left to teach at Vanderbilt. She and I had worked adjacent to each other on 3 separate cases over the years. She is the sharpest person I have ever met in a professional context, and I say that having met a great many very sharp people, I did not call ahead. I showed up at her door. When she opened it, she looked at me, then at the watch on my wrist, and said, "Come inside, Danny." Her voice was quiet and had the quality of someone who has spent a career recognizing when something is wrong. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is itself a skill most people don't possess. When I finished, she held out her hand, and I placed the watch in it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she set it down on the kitchen counter and said, in the manner of someone confirming something they already suspected, "There's a microphone in this thing, and unless I'm wrong, and I'm not often wrong, a camera, and a transmitter that's been relaying your location since the day you put it on." I had known, on some level. I had known when I sat at the kitchen table the night before, but hearing it said by Beverly Okafor in the daylight of her kitchen turned it into something different, something solid, something that couldn't be walked back. "Your son has been listening to everything," she said. Every room you've been in. Every conversation. He knows the people you've spoken to. What you've said to them. Where you've gone. She looked at me directly. Danny, this isn't a family problem. This is a federal crime. I know, I said. What do you want to do? I want to press charges, I said. And I want to understand why. We drove to the Nashville field office that afternoon. Beverly had contacts there. She always had contacts everywhere. And within 2 hours, I was sitting across from a special agent named Thomas Ware, a methodical man in his late 40s, who examined the watch with gloved hands and growing visible concern. My son, Marcus Harmon, I said. He gave me this approximately 5 weeks ago and told me it was a health monitoring device. Agent Ware looked up from the watch. He had the expression of someone connecting dots they'd been looking at separately for a while. Mr. Harmon, he said slowly, do you know who your son works for? He's in financial consulting, I said. His firm is based in... Agent Ware held up one hand. He turned to a second agent in the room, a younger woman named Singh, and something passed between them, the kind of look that is itself a communication. Mr. Harmon, Agent Ware said, we need to make some calls, but I want you to know that you are not alone in what you've brought to us today. They put me in a safe room for 2 hours. When Ware came back in, he had a file folder and a different expression, no longer careful, now grave. Marcus Harmon is employed nominally by a consulting firm, he said. But that firm is a front entity. We've been tracking the organization that runs it for 14 months. They recruit individuals with existing family relationships to high-value targets, people with assets, property, inheritance potential. They provide the technology, the script, the protocol. The operative runs the isolation campaign. The organization extracts financially from the target over time. I said nothing for a moment. I was a federal judge for 31 years, and I have heard terrible things described in clinical language, and I have learned to let them settle before I respond. How many? I asked. 18 confirmed, Ware said. Possibly 25, spanning 9 states. Your device, the LifeSync Pro, which is not a registered medical device anywhere in this country. We've recovered identical units in 4 other cases. They're manufactured overseas. The camera, the microphone, the GPS relay, all of it is embedded in a housing that passes casual inspection. My son, I said, was paid to do this. Yes, Ware said. He was recruited 8 months ago. The financial agreement was structured around duration of compliance and value of assets. I thought about Ruth, about Marcus standing in my kitchen holding that box with his careful hands, about the notes she used to leave in my briefcase, about how grief can become a door that the wrong person learns to walk through. That's when Marcus called. My phone was on the table between us. All of us looked at it. Ware nodded. I answered, Dad. Marcus's voice was different from any version I'd heard before, stripped entirely of performance. Flat and cold in a way I hadn't known he was capable of. Where are you? The watch shows you left home 6 hours ago. It shows you're somewhere in the federal district. I'm at the FBI field office, I said. I think you already know that. A sound came through the phone that I cannot fully describe. Not a word. Something in between. I'm going to give you one chance, he said. Walk out of there. Come home. We can manage this. I'll explain everything. You'll understand why I... No, I said. Dad, I want you to listen to me, Marcus. And I want you to hear me clearly. The way I always hoped you'd hear me when it mattered. I spent 31 years on the federal bench. I know what evidence looks like. I know what it means. And I know that you made a choice not because you were confused, not because you were misled, but because someone offered you money, and you said yes. I hope you find a way to live with that. But I'm done protecting you from the consequences of it. I ended the call. Agent Ware picked up the watch from the table with both hands. He looked at it the way you look at something that has been masquerading as something else for long enough that the masquerade almost worked. We arrested Marcus Harmon at the Nashville airport 4 hours later. He had purchased a ticket to Atlanta. What followed is the part of the story that requires its own kind of patience. The part where justice moves at the pace. Justice moves, measured in depositions and hearings, and the careful architecture of a federal case rather than in any satisfying rush toward resolution. Beverly worked alongside the FBI task force, drawing on her cyber division expertise to authenticate the watch's surveillance components and link them to the manufacturing network overseas. Gerald Beaumont, who turned out to have more spine than anyone gives retired surgeons credit for, submitted an expert medical affidavit explaining that the electromagnetic emissions from the device were entirely consistent with the induced cardiac symptoms I had experienced and entirely inconsistent with any legitimate medical monitoring technology on the market. Patricia, my former clerk, testified about the shift she'd observed in me over the weeks, the way my voice had changed, the way I'd declined invitations I would ordinarily have accepted, the way I had begun to sound. She said, like a man who has started believing someone else's version of himself. The trial lasted 9 days. Marcus's defense argued, predictably, that his actions were motivated by genuine concern, that the surveillance was an excess of devotion, that a son who loved his aging, grieving father could perhaps be forgiven for going too far in his attempt to protect him. I sat in the witness box on the 4th day and I told the jury exactly what I told you today. Every detail, every symptom, every phone call. The morning I took the watch off and felt myself return. The moment Marcus threatened to question my capacity for judgment. The phone call from the FBI field office. His voice stripped of every pretense. The defense cross-examined me for 90 minutes. They asked whether grief had distorted my perception. They asked whether my age made me susceptible to misinterpreting concern as control. They asked, in language designed to plant doubt, whether a man in his 60s, living alone after significant loss, might not be the most reliable narrator of his own experience. I looked at the jury when I answered. I looked specifically at the older jurors, 3 women over 60. One man I estimated at 68, and I said this. I am 63 years old. I ran 3 miles this morning before I came to this courthouse. I served on the federal bench for 31 years. I have evaluated more testimony and more evidence than most people encounter in a lifetime. I know the difference between being cared for and being owned, and I know which one my son chose. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on federal wiretapping charges, guilty on elder abuse, guilty on wire fraud, guilty on conspiracy to commit financial exploitation. 4 counts, 4 verdicts, each one reading the same word. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest with you about that. I felt something quieter and more complicated, the way you feel when a long illness finally breaks. When you've been waiting for the fever to pass for so long that relief doesn't feel celebratory, just real, just true. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked whether I had anything to say. I said that what happened to me was not unique, that across this country, people were sitting in homes with devices they had been told were gifts and were being watched through them and listened to and slowly separated from the lives they had built, and that the people doing it were not strangers. They were people who knew exactly which door to use. The FBI task force used the evidence from my case to dismantle the network's domestic operations. 17 other individuals were identified and contacted. Several of them wept when agents told them what the device they'd been wearing actually was, not because they were surprised, but because they had suspected and had been too afraid, too isolated, too thoroughly convinced of their own unreliability to trust the suspicion. Marcus cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He provided details about the network's structure, its recruitment methods, the specific protocol they had developed for targets like me, widowed, isolated, financially stable, with family members positioned to approach from an angle of care. I have not spoken to him since the call from the FBI field office. I don't know if I ever will. That is a question I hold without trying to answer it yet. What I know is this. 6 months after the verdict, Beverly and I launched a nonprofit called Clear Contact. Its mission is to educate people, particularly older Americans, about technology-enabled coercive control, to help medical professionals identify symptoms consistent with device-induced cardiac interference, and to provide legal advocacy resources to survivors navigating a system that was not designed with them in mind. I am back on the river every morning, 3 miles, sometimes 4. I am working on a paper with Beverly about the evidentiary framework for prosecuting technology-based elder abuse, because the law has not kept pace with the technology, and that is a problem I have the background to help fix. I have lunch with Gerald every Wednesday. I called Patricia last Tuesday just to talk. The watch, the LifeSync Pro, unit number 4 of 23 recovered from this network, sits in an evidence storage facility somewhere in Nashville. It will eventually be destroyed as part of case closure. That's fine. I don't need to see it again. I saw it clearly enough. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to say something to you directly. The story I've told you is not a story about a son who was evil. I don't think Marcus is evil. I think he was someone who was approached at a vulnerable moment in his own life. I didn't know it at the time, but he was in significant financial trouble and offered a structured way to hurt someone he had complicated feelings about, disguised as a structured way to help someone he loved. I think he told himself enough of the second story to go through with the first one. That is not innocence, but it is not the same as pure malice. The story is about what happens when we let love become a reason to stop asking questions. About what happens when someone hands us a narrative: you are vulnerable, you need watching over. This device will keep you safe, and we accept it because the person handing it to us is someone we trust. Real care does not require surveillance. Real love does not need to know your GPS coordinates at every moment of your day. Real concern for your well-being does not isolate you from every person in your life who might notice something is wrong. I know those things now in a way I did not know them before. I wish I had learned them differently. Ruth used to say, and I have thought about this more times in the past year than I can count, that the people who love you best are the ones who make you more yourself, not less, who open doors, not close them, who want you to have the widest possible life, not a narrow one arranged for their convenience. If you are listening to this, and something in it resonates, if you recognize a dynamic, a device, a person, a pattern, I want you to tell someone. Not tomorrow, today. Tell a friend, a doctor, a former colleague, a neighbor. Tell someone who knew you before. The instinct to protect the person controlling you is powerful. I understand it. I felt it. I am a man who spent his career understanding the mechanisms of law, and I still felt it. If you feel it too, that does not mean you are weak. It means you are human, but you deserve to be free. If you want to know what happened next to the network, to the other survivors, to everything that has unfolded since that Tuesday morning in the diner, when the room tilted and a watch on my wrist glowed its patient green, I'll be telling more of it in the weeks ahead. For now, I want to know you're there. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who is being cared for a little too carefully, watched a little too closely, kept a little too safe, share it with them. The truth is always worth saying out loud. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it.